David Carter, a brilliant financial analyst at the top of his field, has always played by the rules in the corporate world. But there's one rule he won't follow, that is shaking hands with Richard Blake, the CEO of his company. Blake, a powerful figure at the helm of a Fortune 500 company, has long been rumored to hold deeply ingrained racist views. While his reputation is whispered about, no one dares to openly challenge him, except for David. At a prestigious company event, Blake strides toward David, extending his hand with a smug smile, as if expecting David's compliance. The room seems to freeze as everyone watches, anticipating the usual pleasantries. But David doesn't flinch. He doesn't reach out. He stands firm, letting the tension simmer in the air. This isn't just a refusal of a handshake, it's a statement, a bold and defiant stand against the man whose biased views have gone unchecked for years. Blake's smile falters, replaced with a look of surprise and growing anger. The entire room seems to hold its breath, waiting for the fallout. David's refusal to shake Richard Blake's hand was no ordinary act of defiance. It was a moment charged with unspoken tension, years of simmering resentment, and the weight of racial prejudice that had hung over the company like a dark cloud. For a few agonizing seconds, time seemed to stretch as the room fell into a stunned silence. Executives exchanged nervous glances, some shocked by the sheer boldness of David's move, others visibly uncomfortable, as if they had been complicit in letting Blake's discriminatory behavior slide for too long. Blake, known for his icy demeanor and tight grip on power, visibly bristled. His hand, still outstretched, began to lower as his face hardened with disbelief. For the first time, someone had challenged his authority, not through words but through a silent, unmistakable gesture of rejection. The room could feel the storm brewing. What no one knew in that moment was that this simple refusal would trigger a series of events that would shake the very foundations of the company. What was supposed to be a routine board meeting in a few days would turn into a confrontation that no one could have predicted. And when the truth finally came out, the balance of power would shift in ways no one could have imagined. David had set something in motion, and there was no turning back now. But before we dive into this shocking story of corporate defiance and justice, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on these powerful, eye-opening stories that challenge perceptions and spark conversation. David Carter had always been a man who believed in the power of hard work and perseverance. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had faced his share of challenges, but nothing could deter him from pursuing his dreams. Armed with a degree in finance from a respected university, David had entered the corporate world with ambition and a determination to rise through the ranks. He wasn't just smart, he was driven. His analytical skills were unmatched, and he quickly became known for his ability to solve complex financial puzzles that left others stumped. David joined the prestigious firm 5 years ago, starting out in an entry-level role. His work ethic quickly earned him respect from his peers and even some senior management, but despite his consistent success, he always seemed to hit an invisible wall when it came to promotions. Colleagues with less experience and fewer accomplishments moved ahead of him, leaving David frustrated but undeterred. He knew he was doing everything right, delivering on every project, meeting every deadline, and even going beyond what was required. Yet there was always an excuse, a reason why this wasn't his time to move up. As the years passed, David became more aware of the subtle, insidious ways in which race played a role in the company's culture. He would notice how other black employees seemed to face similar struggles, always praised for their hard work, but never quite given the opportunities to advance. The leadership was predominantly white, and it seemed that no matter how hard someone like David worked, there was a ceiling that wouldn't break. Still, David held on. He believed that if he just kept proving himself, things would eventually change. But as he approached his 5th year in the company, the weight of his unacknowledged efforts and the systemic barriers became too much to ignore. He was tired of being passed over, tired of the subtle biases that were never addressed, and most of all, tired of Richard Blake's open disregard for people like him. Blake had always been the kind of CEO who thrived on control. He treated the company as his personal kingdom, where his decisions were final and unquestioned. While Blake's overt racist behavior was never on full display in public, rumors about his disdain for minority employees circulated frequently. He had an uncanny way of making David feel small through offhand remarks, microaggressions, and veiled criticisms that questioned David's competence despite his record of success. Blake was a symbol of everything David had fought against his entire life, but this time David wasn't going to stay silent. His refusal to shake Blake's hand wasn't just a moment of pride, it was the culmination of years of frustration and a quiet determination to stand for something bigger than himself. David had reached a breaking point, and this time he would make sure his stand was heard. Richard Blake was the embodiment of power, privilege, and control. As the CEO of one of the largest financial firms in the country, his reputation stretched far beyond the company walls. He had clawed his way to the top years ago, building a career on ruthless decision-making and a relentless pursuit of profit. Blake was known for making swift, often brutal decisions that left no room for dissent. His boardroom presence alone could silence an entire room. But behind the glossy corporate success story, there was a darker truth. Blake had long been whispered about in the corridors of his company. Rumors circulated about his biases, his preference for hiring and promoting individuals who looked like him, white, male, and privileged. While he was careful to never make overtly racist statements in public, his private remarks told a different story. Blake was a man who believed that the people in power should stay in power, and to him, that power belonged to people like him. There had been multiple occasions where his actions hinted at his deep-seated prejudice. From selectively cutting funding to diversity initiatives to conveniently losing promotion applications from minority employees, Blake's influence permeated every corner of the company. He had a way of speaking that always left room for plausible deniability, coated in professionalism, but with just enough sting to remind people where they stood in his eyes. It was no coincidence that nearly all the top executives were white, and Blake's track record for sidelining talented black employees was not just an oversight, it was a pattern. For years, his behavior had gone unchallenged. After all, Blake was the CEO. He held the reins, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of his wrath. His position allowed him to operate unchecked, and the board was more concerned with the company's soaring profits than addressing the systemic racism that lingered under Blake's leadership. Most employees, fearful for their jobs and careers, chose to look the other way. Even those who knew better stayed silent, believing that challenging a man like Blake was a losing battle. But Blake's arrogance was also his blind spot. He had ruled the company for so long without question that he never imagined anyone would openly defy him. His power had shielded him from accountability for years, and he had come to believe that nothing could ever threaten his position. He saw people like David as little more than cogs in the corporate machine, useful when needed, but ultimately replaceable. What Blake didn't know was that his grip on the company and his unchecked authority were about to be tested in a way he had never anticipated. David's refusal to shake his hand was just the beginning, and for the first time in his career, Blake was about to face consequences that even he couldn't control. The company David worked for was a picture-perfect image of corporate success on the surface. Sleek glass offices, high-profile clients, and an aura of professionalism made it seem like an ideal place to work. But underneath the polished exterior, there was a stark divide that few talked about openly. The racial tension in the company was subtle, yet pervasive. While diversity initiatives were advertised, they were often more performative than impactful. Black employees, like David, knew all too well that climbing the corporate ladder was an uphill battle. The company's leadership team, composed almost entirely of white executives, maintained a homogeneous culture that stifled real change. Most of the company's decision-makers came from similar backgrounds, reinforcing an old boys club atmosphere that felt inaccessible to anyone who didn't fit their mold. For employees like David, it was clear that no matter how hard they worked or how qualified they were, there was always an invisible ceiling. Promotions were given based on connections and comfort rather than merit, and those connections were typically reserved for white employees who shared a common cultural background with the leadership. The subtle racial bias was woven into the everyday interactions at the company. David's peers often acknowledged his brilliance, but there was an underlying sense of skepticism about his capabilities from certain colleagues, particularly those close to the top. His ideas were praised, but rarely adopted, and even when they were, someone else often took the credit. It was as if he was being kept in a box, allowed to shine, but never fully seen. People would compliment his hard work, yet sideline him when it came to key projects. His superiors acknowledged his expertise in private, but in front of the broader team, they minimized his role. While some colleagues were supportive, recognizing the racial inequities in the company, they felt powerless to make any changes. There was a sense that speaking out could cost them their jobs or label them as troublemakers. Others, however, stayed comfortably silent, either indifferent to the discrimination or unwilling to jeopardize their positions by challenging the status quo. Despite this, David had carved out a quiet reputation for himself as someone who couldn't be ignored, even if he wasn't always given the credit he deserved. He was known as a problem solver, the one people turned to when a complex financial issue arose. His work spoke for itself, and that had earned him a level of respect from his peers. But while his peers appreciated his skill, many still treated him as an outsider, someone capable, but never quite on the same level as those in the upper echelons of the company. This unspoken divide left a lingering tension that most employees chose to ignore, but David couldn't. He saw through the company's veneer of equality, and it had become clear that no matter how much talent or effort he brought to the table, he would always be seen as the other. This atmosphere of subtle, persistent discrimination created an undercurrent of frustration, not just for David, but for many minority employees who felt the weight of their identities in every interaction, meeting, and missed opportunity. The moment had finally come. The entire company was gathered in the grand ballroom of the luxury hotel, celebrating another year of success. The air was thick with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. But David Carter wasn't in a celebratory mood. He stood near the back, his eyes fixed on the man making his way through the crowd. Richard Blake. The CEO was all smiles, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and basking in the glow of the company's triumphs. Blake approached, his hand outstretched toward David, his expression carrying that same arrogant expectation. The room seemed to freeze. David's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing through the years of quiet disrespect, the moments of humiliation, and the endless waiting for opportunities that never came. This was it. The moment where he would take a stand, not just for himself, but for every colleague who had been sidelined, every person who had been forced to swallow their pride and play along in Blake's game. Blake's hand hung in the air, a smug smile plastered on his face, as if he knew David wouldn't dare to refuse. But then David did the unthinkable. He kept his hands at his sides, refusing to return the gesture. A tense silence fell over the crowd as onlookers slowly realized what was happening. Eyes darted from David to Blake, back and forth, waiting for someone to break the tension. Blake's smile faltered for a moment, his hand dropping to his side as disbelief washed over him. It was a small gesture, but in this corporate world, it was a bold act of rebellion. The CEO stood there, visibly shocked, his face turning red, as he tried to maintain his composure. The chatter in the room hushed, replaced with the awkward silence of discomfort and anticipation. Some executives stared in disbelief, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. David had just broken an unspoken rule. He had refused to acknowledge Blake's authority. And now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. As David stood there, his eyes locked on Richard Blake's outstretched hand, a flood of thoughts rushed through his mind. This wasn't just a handshake. It was a symbol, a power play that had been used to keep people like him in check for far too long. David had shaken enough hands, smiled through enough microaggressions, and swallowed enough of his pride over the years, but this moment was different. He couldn't, no, he wouldn't, go along with the charade anymore, not with Blake, the very embodiment of everything that was wrong with the company. Blake's hand still hung in the air, as if daring David to fall in line, to play the role of the compliant employee, grateful for whatever crumbs were thrown his way. But David knew that shaking that hand would mean more than just a polite gesture. It would mean accepting his place, once again staying silent in the face of the racism that had haunted his career. He remembered the countless times he had been passed over for promotions, the patronizing compliments disguised as praise, the way Blake would talk down to him in meetings, subtly undermining his intelligence in front of others. David's pulse quickened, but he felt strangely calm. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of years of frustration, the weight of every indignity he had endured rising to the surface. He thought of his colleagues, those who had shared the same struggles, who whispered about Blake's prejudices behind closed doors, but never dared to act. He thought of the younger black employees watching him now, those who were just beginning their careers, hoping for a future that didn't involve tiptoeing around men like Blake. This moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making a stand for everyone who had been marginalized, overlooked, and disrespected. David realized that refusing to shake Blake's hand was a small act, but its impact was monumental. It was a refusal to accept the status quo, a way of saying, enough. He had chosen this moment because he knew it would resonate beyond the walls of this event. It was a line in the sand, a decision he had made not just for himself, but for the dignity of every person who had ever felt silenced by Blake's power. As David stood there, refusing to extend his hand, he knew there would be consequences. Blake wouldn't let this go easily. But in that instant, David didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Free from the constraints of corporate politics, free from the fear of retribution. And with that freedom came a sense of purpose. He wasn't just standing up to a CEO, he was standing up to a system that had been broken for far too long. Richard Blake stood there, frozen in disbelief. His hand, now awkwardly by his side, had been left hanging in front of the entire room, by David Carter, of all people. Blake wasn't used to this. He was the CEO, the top dog, the man whose very presence commanded respect, whether it was genuine or not. To be publicly snubbed by a subordinate, especially a black employee, was beyond humiliating. Blake's face flushed, the red creeping up from his neck as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. He could feel the eyes of his executives and board members on him, but no one dared say a word. The room, once filled with the soft hum of corporate pleasantries, was now eerily silent. Blake's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he fought to maintain his composure. He was a man who valued control, and losing it in front of his company would be a greater embarrassment than the snub itself. Still, the insult was like a slap in the face, and Blake wasn't someone who let such things slide. There was a flicker of something dangerous in Blake's eyes as he looked at David, an unspoken promise of retribution. He straightened his posture, regaining his air of authority, and forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he said through clenched teeth, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I'll remember this." The threat was subtle, but clear. David had crossed a line, and Blake intended to make him pay for it. The tension in the room didn't dissipate after Blake walked away. David's colleagues exchanged worried glances, some impressed by his courage, others concerned for what this meant for his future. Blake had a long memory, and everyone knew that those who crossed him didn't last long in the company. David's refusal to play along wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a direct challenge to Blake's authority, and the CEO was not the kind of man to take that lightly. Within hours, the consequences of David's actions began to unfold. Emails were sent, meetings were cancelled, and murmurs of his fate spread like wildfire through the office. Blake was making sure David knew who held the power. Small, almost imperceptible moves were being made to isolate him, to make him feel the weight of his decision. His upcoming project presentation, one he had worked tirelessly on, was quietly reassigned to another team. Colleagues who once greeted him with enthusiasm now avoided eye contact, unwilling to be associated with someone who had dared to defy the CEO. David felt the shift immediately, but he stood firm. He had known this would happen. Blake was a man who thrived on control, and when that control was threatened, he retaliated. But David wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after making the choice to stand for something more important than his career. The real battle was only beginning. David's career at the company started with a lot of promise, like many young, ambitious professionals entering the corporate world. When he first joined, David was eager to prove himself, to demonstrate that he was not only capable, but also one of the hardest workers in the firm. He brought fresh ideas, meticulous attention to detail, and an unmatched ability to handle complex financial models that even senior analysts struggled with. His colleagues noticed. His immediate supervisors often complimented him on his work ethic, and it wasn't long before David became the go-to person when a challenging project came along. But despite his undeniable talent, David quickly noticed a pattern. While his hard work earned him recognition, it didn't translate into tangible career advancement. He would watch as other, less experienced colleagues, most of them white, were promoted to roles he was more qualified for. These promotions would often happen with little explanation, except vague comments about company fit or experience. The unspoken truth was clear. No matter how much David excelled, there was always a glass ceiling hanging above him, one that seemed unbreakable. One particular moment stood out. David had been with the company for 2 years when a management position opened up in his department. It was a role he was not only qualified for, but had essentially been doing for months without the official title. He had spearheaded multiple high-level projects, received glowing reviews from clients, and even trained several new employees. Everyone expected David to get the promotion, even his immediate supervisor, who privately told him, "This is your time." But when the promotion was announced, David's name wasn't called. Instead, it went to someone who had been with the company for less than a year, a fresh-faced employee who had just transferred from another department. The decision stunned everyone, including the young man who received the promotion. David tried to hide his disappointment, but it cut deep. This wasn't just about being overlooked, it was about something more. It was about the quiet, unspoken rules that governed the company, where merit and hard work weren't always enough. The justification for the decision was vague at best. David was told that while his work was excellent, the company was looking for someone with different leadership qualities. It was a phrase that meant nothing and everything at the same time. David had been praised for his leadership, his ability to mentor and manage teams, but when it came to the higher ranks, those qualities were somehow dismissed or overlooked. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next few years, the pattern continued. David would consistently exceed expectations, bringing in results that even senior executives acknowledged were impressive. But when it came to promotions, raises, or even public acknowledgement in company meetings, he was routinely passed over. It was as though there was an invisible line he wasn't allowed to cross, no matter how qualified he was or how hard he worked. David began to notice it wasn't just happening to him. Other employees of color faced similar struggles. They would work twice as hard, produce results that spoke for themselves, but when it came to advancement, there was always a reason why it wasn't their time. It was subtle, but clear enough that David couldn't ignore it. The company's leadership, predominantly white, seemed to have its own idea of who fit the mold of leadership, and David, despite his undeniable skills, didn't fit that picture. For years, David tried to rationalize it. Maybe if he worked harder, if he networked more, if he played the game a little better, things would change. But deep down, he knew the truth. The problem wasn't with him or his abilities. The problem was with the system, one that quietly, persistently kept people like him from rising to the top. As time passed, David's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to play the game anymore. He was done waiting for recognition that would never come, done staying silent in a company that refused to see his worth. It was this realization that set the stage for what was to come, the moment when David would finally refuse to shake the hand of the man who had come to represent everything wrong with the company. For David, the daily grind at the company wasn't just about meeting deadlines and completing projects. It was about navigating an environment rife with microaggressions and subtle racism. These slights, though often dismissed by others as unintentional or harmless, took a cumulative toll on him over the years. They reminded him, in ways big and small, that no matter how hard he worked, he was still seen as different by many of his colleagues. One of the first incidents David experienced occurred during a team meeting early in his career. He had spent weeks preparing a detailed financial analysis that would help the company secure a major contract. As he presented his findings, he noticed the way his white colleagues would frequently interrupt him, questioning minor details while brushing off his more significant points. When another analyst, a white man, rephrased David's exact recommendations, suddenly the room seemed to agree with the proposal. It was subtle but unmistakable. David's ideas were only taken seriously when they were repackaged by someone else. It didn't stop there. Over time, he became accustomed to the small but stinging comments. "Wow, you're so articulate," a manager once said to him after a presentation, as though surprised that a black man could speak with such clarity and professionalism. "You must have been a real standout in your community," someone else remarked, as if to suggest David's success was an anomaly in his background. These comments, always framed as compliments, carried the unspoken assumption that someone like David wasn't expected to be as capable as his white counterparts. Then there were the more overt moments, those that stung deeper because of their blatant disregard for his dignity. During one particularly high-stress period at work, when the team was pulling long hours, a senior executive made a joke about David's work ethic. "You're fast, David, but then again, you people are used to hard labor." The room went quiet, the laughter awkward and forced. David looked around, searching for anyone willing to stand up and say something, but all he saw were nervous faces avoiding eye contact. No one defended him. No one acknowledged the ugliness of the comment. Instead, the moment passed as though it never happened, leaving David alone to bear the weight of it. Even in more casual settings, David felt the sting of being othered. At company social events, colleagues would make offhanded remarks about him not fitting in with the company's culture, or jokingly ask him to share stories about his rough upbringing, a narrative they had projected onto him without ever bothering to know the truth. When team members gathered for drinks or socialized outside of work, David was often left out of the invitations. He couldn't help but notice that the informal networking opportunities, the ones that often led to promotions, were dominated by white employees, further reinforcing the invisible walls that kept him from advancing. Each of these experiences, though seemingly small on their own, built up over time. They formed an undeniable pattern that David could no longer ignore. He had spent years trying to brush them off, telling himself that as long as he worked harder, he could overcome them. But the truth was, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to prove himself, he was constantly reminded that in the eyes of many, he didn't belong. These microaggressions weren't just isolated incidents. They were a constant undercurrent of his day-to-day experience in the company, slowly eroding his sense of belonging and worth. David knew he wasn't alone in facing these challenges. Other black employees shared similar stories of being passed over, talked down to, and treated like outsiders. And yet nothing ever changed. The company's leadership remained largely indifferent, content to let things continue as they were. For David, the realization that these subtle acts of racism were not just personal attacks, but systemic problems solidified his resolve. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about confronting the system that allowed these behaviors to persist. There were several moments during David's career where he came close to walking away. The frustration of being constantly overlooked, the microaggressions, and the weight of never feeling truly seen began to take a toll on him. Each of these moments could have been the end of his journey at the company, but something inside David kept pushing him forward. One such instance came after a major project that David had spearheaded. He had worked long hours, meticulously ensuring that every detail was perfect, and when the deal finally closed, it was one of the company's largest contracts to date. Everyone knew that David had been the driving force behind the success. Yet when it came time to celebrate the win at an all-hands meeting, his name was barely mentioned. Instead, the credit went to his immediate supervisor, a man who had barely contributed to the project. As applause filled the room for someone else's work, David felt his stomach turn. He had never felt so invisible. That night, as he sat alone at home, he drafted a resignation letter, ready to leave it all behind. But before hitting send, he remembered something his mentor had once told him. "You've worked too hard to let them take this from you. You belong here, even if they don't see it." David tore up the letter and went to bed with a renewed sense of purpose. Another pivotal moment came during a team reorganization. David had been with the company for years and was one of the most experienced analysts on his team. But when the time came to restructure, he was passed over for a leadership position, one that went to a newer, less qualified colleague. The blow was hard to take. David spent the weekend considering his options, thinking maybe this was the universe telling him it was time to move on. But on Monday, as he sat at his desk, something shifted. He realized that leaving wouldn't solve the problem. It would only let them win. Instead of quitting, he resolved to keep pushing forward, knowing that his perseverance would eventually lead to something bigger. These moments weren't just about his own career frustrations. They were about the larger system of inequality that David and many others faced every day. Each time he thought about leaving, something held him back. The idea that maybe, just maybe, by staying, he could change things not just for himself, but for everyone like him who had been overlooked and underestimated. With every slight, every missed promotion, David's determination only grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for a career anymore, he was fighting for respect and for justice. It was this resilience that set the stage for his ultimate confrontation with Richard Blake, a stand that had been building for years. Richard Blake was fuming. David's public refusal to shake his hand had been more than just an insult. It was a challenge to Blake's authority in front of the entire company. Blake wasn't just embarrassed, he was enraged. He had built his career on being untouchable, on commanding respect through intimidation and control, and for someone like David to openly defy him was something he couldn't let stand. This wasn't just about David anymore, it was about setting an example. Blake knew exactly how he would respond. He had always been a calculated man, never one to act out of pure emotion, and he wasn't about to change now. The upcoming board meeting would be his chance to crush David for good, to make sure that everyone in the company knew what happened when you crossed him. Blake began to plot meticulously, using his connections and influence to set the stage. He contacted a few key members of the board, making sure they understood his version of events, painting David as reckless, disrespectful, and unfit for his role. To Blake, this was more than just a confrontation, it was a power play. He would ruin David's reputation, strip him of any authority, and make sure his career at the company came to a swift and brutal end. Behind the scenes, Blake had his team dig through David's record, searching for any small mistake or misstep that could be used against him. Even the most minor oversight would be enough to call David's competence into question. If Blake couldn't find anything, he was willing to fabricate it, whatever it took to tear David down in front of the board. And Blake had the advantage. He had been in the game long enough to know how to manipulate the narrative, to bend the truth just enough to get people on his side. But what drove Blake the most wasn't just his desire to punish David, it was his fear of losing control. David's act of defiance was a sign of something Blake hadn't seen coming, a shift in the power dynamics at the company. If David's stand gained momentum, if others saw it as a sign that they too could challenge Blake's authority, then the fortress Blake had built around himself could start to crumble. So this wasn't just about humiliating David, it was about sending a message to everyone in the company. No one, no matter how skilled or brave, could get away with questioning Blake's supremacy. The board meeting would be Blake's stage, and he would make sure that David wouldn't just lose the battle, he'd lose everything. But what Blake didn't realize was that David had already started preparing for this moment, and the balance of power was about to shift in ways Blake couldn't control. As the board meeting loomed closer, the tension around the office grew palpable. David could feel the eyes on him, the hushed conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the sympathetic looks from colleagues who knew Blake was coming after him. And yet, while the world around him buzzed with nervous anticipation, David remained unusually calm. It wasn't that he didn't feel the weight of what was about to happen. Inside, he was nervous, Anyone would be. Blake was a powerful man with decades of experience, influence, and an iron grip on the company. David knew Blake wasn't the type to forgive or forget. The CEO would make sure that this board meeting would be his opportunity to destroy David's reputation once and for all. But unlike others, David wasn't walking into this battle unprepared. He had a plan. For the past few weeks, ever since the handshake incident, David had been quietly gathering information. He had allies in places Blake didn't expect, people who had seen the darker side of Blake's leadership but had been too afraid to speak up. Some of them were board members, others were senior executives who had grown tired of Blake's manipulation and the toxic environment he had fostered. David knew that if Blake wanted to make an example out of him, he had to be ready to fight back, and he had spent his time doing just that, quietly, methodically, and with precision. David had prepared himself mentally, knowing that Blake would try to rattle him, to make him feel small in front of the board. But he also knew something Blake didn't. This meeting wouldn't go the way the CEO planned. While Blake had been working behind the scenes to tear him down, David had been building a case, one that would expose Blake's abuses of power in a way no one could ignore. It wasn't just about David's career anymore. It was about exposing the culture of fear Blake had created, and David was ready to use the truth as his weapon. As he sat at his desk, the minutes ticking down to the meeting, David took a deep breath. His mind was clear, his plan in place. Yes, he was nervous, but his confidence came from something deeper, a sense of purpose. This was bigger than him, and he knew it. He was no longer the young, ambitious analyst trying to fit into a system that was designed to keep him out. Now, he was the one rewriting the rules. As the day of the board meeting approached, the office was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Everywhere David went, he could hear the murmurs. People spoke in hushed tones in the break room, exchanged glances in the hallways, and sent cryptic messages across their desks. Everyone knew that this meeting wasn't just a routine check-in, it was going to be a showdown. And everyone wanted to know how it would end. Some believed Blake was gearing up to publicly humiliate David, that he'd use the meeting to strip David of any remaining authority and force him out. They whispered about Blake's ego, about how a man like him couldn't stand being challenged, especially not in front of his peers. Rumor had it that Blake had been pulling strings behind the scenes, gathering dirt on David, preparing to turn the board against him. "Blake's going to bury him," one colleague muttered during lunch. "There's no way David makes it out of this intact." Others weren't so sure. They had seen the quiet determination in David's eyes, the way he carried himself over the past few weeks. He wasn't acting like someone who was afraid of what was coming. In fact, he seemed more focused, more composed than ever. A few people speculated that David had something up his sleeve, that maybe he wasn't walking into this meeting blind. "He's too calm," one senior analyst said over coffee. "If Blake thinks he's going to walk all over him, I think he's in for a surprise." There were whispers about what might happen if David fought back. Some wondered if he had information that could hurt Blake. Something big enough to change the tide in his favor. The company's leadership had been untouchable for so long, but if anyone could shake the status quo, it might just be David. "He's smart, methodical," a colleague said to another. "If anyone's going to take down Blake, it's him." The tension in the office was thick. Everyone had their own theory, but no one knew for sure what would happen. One thing, however, was certain. The board meeting was going to be unlike any other. It was no longer just about corporate strategy or quarterly numbers. It was about power, and the battle lines had been drawn. All anyone could do now was wait and see who would come out on top. The atmosphere in the boardroom was tense as the members took their seats. At the head of the table sat Richard Blake, exuding an air of quiet authority. Blake surveyed the room with a practiced gaze, his expression cold and calculating. He was in his element, confident that this meeting would go exactly as he had planned. This was his domain, and everyone knew it. As the meeting began, Blake wasted no time in asserting control. He leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him, and his voice, though calm, carried a weight that demanded attention. "Before we proceed with today's agenda, I'd like to address a pressing matter," he began, casting a sidelong glance at David. The words were casual, almost offhand, but everyone knew what was coming. "It has come to my attention that certain individuals in this company have overstepped their boundaries, undermining the chain of command and, quite frankly, showing a lack of respect for the leadership that has brought us this far." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, and the tension in the room thickened. Blake's eyes shifted deliberately to David, making it clear that the remark was directed at him. "Now, I've always valued professionalism and decorum in this company," Blake continued, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of menace. "But recent events have made it clear that some people need a reminder of who holds the reins here." The board members glanced at one another, uneasy. They knew Blake's style well enough to recognize what was happening. He was setting the stage, preparing to tear David down in front of everyone. Blake's tactic was simple. He wanted to humiliate David, to remind him, and everyone else, who was really in control. Blake went on, "When a company achieves the kind of success that we have, it's important to remember that it's built on leadership, strong, decisive leadership. And when individuals decide to challenge that leadership without cause, they do more than just disrespect their superiors, they undermine the foundation of the entire company." His gaze rested heavily on David, the room thick with silence. Blake's words were carefully chosen, designed to paint David as reckless and insubordinate. He wasn't addressing the real issue, the racial tension, the years of mistreatment, but instead twisting the narrative to make David look like the aggressor, the problem that needed to be dealt with. It was a master stroke of corporate manipulation, and Blake delivered it with precision. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if daring David to respond. The message was clear. David had stepped out of line, and Blake intended to put him back in his place, publicly, for all to see. David sat quietly as Blake finished his thinly veiled attack, the tension in the room growing with every word. All eyes shifted towards him, waiting for his response. But unlike the rest of the board members, David wasn't nervous. He wasn't shaken by Blake's attempt to belittle him. Instead, he calmly gathered his papers, stood up, and slowly walked to the head of the table, standing just a few feet away from Blake. The boardroom fell into a hushed silence, everyone curious to see how this would play out. When David spoke, his voice was measured, steady. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Blake," he began, meeting Blake's cold gaze head-on. "But I think it's time we all took a closer look at the foundation you're so proud of." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before reaching into his folder and pulling out a series of documents. Blake's confident smirk faltered just slightly as David continued. "For the past few months, I've been quietly conducting my own research into certain dealings within this company, particularly those that involve Mr. Blake's leadership." David's tone remained calm, but the gravity of what he was saying was clear. The board members leaned forward, sensing the shift. This wasn't just a defense. David was about to drop a bombshell. He spread the documents on the table, pushing them towards the board members. What you're looking at are detailed financial records, off-the-books transactions, shell companies, and insider trading. All of them point back to Mr. Blake. Gasps filled the room as the board members picked up the papers, their faces turning pale as they absorbed the information. "This is just the beginning," David said. "These records show how Blake has been manipulating the company's stock prices, using insider information to make millions for himself and a select few. But that's not all." David stepped closer to Blake, who was now visibly sweating. "There are also records of funds being siphoned off into private accounts. Money that was meant for company initiatives, diversity programs, employee benefits, disappeared, redirected into Mr. Blake's personal empire." The room was in chaos. Some board members were frantically flipping through the documents, while others stared at Blake, their shock quickly turning to anger. Blake tried to maintain his composure, but his face had gone red with panic. "This is absurd," he stammered, attempting to regain control. "You can't prove any of this." David smiled, anticipating Blake's denial. "Actually, I can," he said coolly. "I've spent the last few months working with a legal team, and as of this morning, this information has been sent to the SEC and federal investigators, so yes, I can prove it. And so can they." Blake's confidence shattered. He had underestimated David, assuming he would be easily crushed under the pressure. But now Blake was the one cornered, facing not just the loss of his career, but potential legal consequences. The board members, realizing the gravity of the situation, began to distance themselves from Blake, the man they had once feared now crumbling before their eyes. But David wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, turning to the board members. "In my research, I also uncovered Blake's role in fostering the toxic culture that's been festering here for years: racism, discrimination, and the silencing of voices like mine. He's built a system that rewards conformity and punishes those who challenge it. But it ends today." David's words hit like a hammer. The board members looked at one another, fully aware of the weight of the accusations. Blake, who had ruled through intimidation and fear for so long, had finally met his match. As David sat back down, his voice calm but filled with conviction, he delivered the final blow. "This company deserves better, and today we have a chance to make it right." The room was silent, the enormity of what had just happened sinking in. Blake, the once untouchable CEO, sat paralyzed, his world unraveling before him. David had not only exposed his corruption, but also stripped him of the very power he had wielded for years. Now the only question that remained was how far Blake's fall would go. The room was in chaos. As David laid out the damning evidence, the board members were left reeling. Papers were passed around, their hands shaking as they reviewed the documents. Eyes darted back and forth, from the incriminating papers to Blake and then to David, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Shock and disbelief rippled across their faces. These were powerful, well-connected people, but none of them had ever expected to be blindsided like this. One of the older board members, a man who had been with the company for decades, spoke first. Is this real?" His voice was barely a whisper, as if saying it aloud made it harder to deny. The others were silent, but their expressions said everything. They were horrified, not just by the scale of Blake's corruption, but by the fact that they had been blind to it for so long. A younger member, known for his sharp business acumen, was next to speak. "How did we not see this?" he muttered, his voice tinged with both frustration and fear. He glanced at the documents again, his brow furrowed in disbelief. This is beyond unethical. This is criminal." He slammed the papers down on the table, his face flushed with anger. We've been sitting here, rubber-stamping his decisions, while he's been robbing this company blind." Others quickly chimed in, their voices rising as the full weight of David's revelations sank in. "We trusted him. How could he do this?" one shouted, her voice trembling. "He's been lying to all of us, manipulating us." A palpable sense of betrayal swept through the room. For years, these board members had supported Blake, had placed their trust in him to steer the company forward. Now they were grappling with the reality that they had been complicit in his misdeeds. The anger, once directed at David for daring to defy the CEO, had now turned toward Blake, and it wasn't just professional outrage, it was personal. As the shock gave way to fury, several members began discussing the immediate next steps. They couldn't just sit on this information. The board was now facing its own crisis, and damage control had to begin immediately. "We need to distance ourselves from him," one of the senior members finally declared, his voice authoritative. "Blake can't remain CEO, not for another second. We have to protect the company. We have to act now." For the first time in his career, Richard Blake sat in stunned silence. His grip on the armrests tightened as he watched the board members turn on him, their voices rising in anger, their disbelief quickly morphing into accusations. His usual air of superiority had evaporated. The carefully constructed persona of control and power that he had cultivated for years was unraveling in real time, and Blake was powerless to stop it. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? The documents David had presented were irrefutable. The board members weren't fools. They could see the truth for themselves, and no amount of corporate posturing or spin could fix this. For the first time in his life, Blake found himself at a complete loss. His mind raced, grasping at any possible way out, any strategy to salvage what remained of his crumbling empire, but it was useless. He had been outmaneuvered. Blake's usual calm demeanor began to crack. His face flushed a deep red, and his breathing grew shallow. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. David was supposed to be humiliated, cast out, and forgotten. But now it was Blake who was being cornered, exposed in front of the very people who had once feared and respected him. His hands trembled slightly as he realized how precarious his situation had become. His empire, his reputation, everything he had built was slipping away, and he couldn't stop it. He tried to speak again, this time forcing out a weak defense. This is all a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "I can explain," but his words fell flat. The board wasn't listening. They didn't care about his explanations. They had already made up their minds, and Blake could see it in their eyes. The power he had wielded for so long was gone. No one feared him anymore. As the board members continued to talk over him, discussing his immediate removal, Blake's world began to close in. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, the king of his corporate kingdom. But now, as he sat in that room, watching everything fall apart, he realized just how fragile his kingdom had been. His empire wasn't built on strength or loyalty. It was built on fear and deceit. And now that the truth had come out, there was nothing left to protect him. For Richard Blake, this wasn't just the end of his career. It was the end of an era. The man who had once ruled through intimidation and control was now reduced to a mere spectator, watching as his power, his influence, and his legacy crumbled before his eyes. David's quiet defiance wasn't born overnight. It had been in the making for months, carefully thought out and meticulously planned. After years of enduring subtle racism, microaggressions, and being passed over for promotions, David had reached a breaking point. But he knew that a direct confrontation with Blake, especially in a company so deeply entrenched, in its toxic corporate culture would require more than just courage, it would require strategy. In the weeks leading up to the fateful board meeting, David had been quietly gathering allies within the company. He understood that going up against someone as powerful and connected as Blake would require support from people who had witnessed the same injustices he had faced. So he began reaching out to those he knew had grievances of their own, other employees who had been marginalized, passed over, or silenced. These weren't just junior employees. Some were high-ranking executives who had been pushed aside by Blake's manipulative ways, silently nursing their frustrations over the years. David's plan was not just about exposing Blake's corruption, but about changing the company from within. He knew that if he could align himself with these key figures, those who had seen the ugly side of Blake's leadership firsthand, he would have the backing he needed to bring the truth to light. And so, over coffee meetings and late-night conversations, David began to build his coalition. Each of them shared stories, provided evidence, and slowly pieced together the larger narrative of Blake's manipulation and unethical practices. But David didn't stop there. He knew that exposing Blake's internal corruption wasn't enough. There needed to be undeniable proof, something that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. With the help of a close friend who worked in legal consulting, David started digging deeper into the company's financials. What he found was shocking. Years of off-the-books transactions, insider trading, and millions of dollars siphoned off into private accounts. It was more than enough to not only take Blake down, but also force the company to reckon with the broader issues of corruption that had plagued it for so long. David didn't want to rush things. He knew that timing was everything. He patiently collected evidence, slowly building a solid case that would be irrefutable in front of the board. By the time the day of the board meeting arrived, David wasn't just prepared. He was armed with the truth, a truth so powerful that not even Blake, with all his influence, would be able to deny it. David's decision to stand up to Richard Blake wasn't just about corporate ethics or career advancement. It was personal, deeply personal. The struggle he had faced within the company mirrored the larger battles he had fought his entire life. As a black man, David had grown up in a world where he was constantly told, directly and indirectly, that he needed to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. This wasn't just about one company or one corrupt CEO. For David, it was about challenging the systemic racism that had shaped his life and the lives of so many others like him. David thought often of his family, of the sacrifices they had made to ensure he could get the education and opportunities they hadn't had. His father, a blue-collar worker who had spent years enduring racism in his own workplace, had always told David to keep his head down, to work hard, and to rise above the prejudice. But his father had also warned him that there would come a time when he couldn't remain silent anymore, when he would need to stand up for himself and for those who couldn't. This was that time. David could no longer allow himself to be complicit in a system that thrived on inequality. He wasn't just fighting for his career, he was fighting for his dignity. But beyond his personal motivations, David also felt the weight of his community on his shoulders. He knew that his actions would have a ripple effect. If he stayed silent, if he allowed Blake to continue unchecked, what message would that send to the younger black employees watching him, to those just starting their careers, looking for role models in an industry that too often excluded them? David didn't want them to face the same barriers he had. He wanted to break those barriers to pave a path for the next generation. His fight with Blake was more than just a battle for power. It was a fight for representation, for justice, and for change. In the quiet moments leading up to the board meeting, David thought about the legacy he wanted to leave behind. This wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about standing for something bigger than himself. His community, his family, his own sense of self-worth. These were the things driving him forward. He couldn't control the outcome, but he knew that whatever happened, he had to be true to himself and to the values he believed in. David wasn't just doing this for him, he was doing it for every person who had ever been made to feel small, every person who had been told they didn't belong. That was what gave him the strength to face Blake head-on, to reveal the truth, and to demand the justice he had been denied for so long. As David stood before the board and his colleagues, revealing the truth about Blake's corruption, his actions sent shockwaves through the company. His decision to stand up to the most powerful man in the room wasn't just about toppling Blake, it was about sending a message to everyone watching. David knew that for years employees had whispered about the toxic culture, about the racism, the unfair treatment, and the constant fear of speaking out. But no one had dared to take a stand until now. David's courage resonated deeply with those who had suffered in silence, unsure of their place in a company that seemed to value conformity over integrity. His defiance wasn't just a bold act of self-preservation, it was a beacon of hope. It showed them that change was possible, that standing up for what was right didn't have to mean standing alone. The ripple effect of his actions was immediate. Other employees, many of whom had been afraid to voice their own frustrations, began to realize that they too had the power to speak up. For the black employees in the company, David's actions carried even greater significance. For too long, they had been sidelined, marginalized, and made to feel invisible. But David's stand against Blake showed them that they weren't powerless, that their voices mattered, that they deserved respect, and that they had the right to demand fair treatment. In a company where people like them had often been ignored, David's stand was a powerful reminder that they had every right to claim their space. But the message didn't stop there. Word of what happened in the boardroom spread beyond the company's walls, reaching other industries and communities. David's stand became a symbol of resistance against not just corporate corruption, but against systemic injustice in all its forms. It showed others that sometimes one person's courage could inspire an entire movement, and that change often begins with a single act of defiance. David's actions encouraged others, both inside and outside the company, to confront the systems that had long kept them silent. David didn't just bring down Blake, he uplifted an entire community of people who had been waiting for someone to show them that change was possible. His message was clear: it's never too late to stand up for what's right. And when you do, you don't just change your own life, you can inspire others to do the same. Blake's world collapsed in a matter of moments. As the truth unraveled and David's revelations sank in, the weight of his actions hit him like a tidal wave. The once untouchable CEO now found himself the center of the storm, with no way to hide. For years, Blake had ruled with arrogance, assuming his wealth and influence would protect him from any consequences. But now, as the eyes of the board turned toward him in disgust and shock, it was clear that the walls were closing in. The silence that followed David's final words was deafening. Blake could feel it, the judgment, the betrayal from those he had thought would stand by his side. His chest tightened as he watched the board members, one by one, pull away from him, distancing themselves not just physically, but morally. His once loyal allies now wanted nothing to do with him. He was no longer the powerful figure commanding respect. He was a man exposed, a leader whose empire was built on lies. Blake tried to gather himself, but his usual confidence faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to deny the accusations or to make some weak attempt at defense, but nothing came out. The words stuck in his throat. His voice, which once commanded boardrooms and struck fear in the hearts of his subordinates, failed him when he needed it most. Instead, he sat frozen in his chair, watching as his entire career crumbled around him. One of the board members, usually reserved and diplomatic, finally broke the silence. "This is unacceptable," she said firmly, her eyes narrowing on Blake. "You've betrayed the trust of this company, and more importantly, its people. We cannot and will not tolerate this." Others nodded in agreement, their faces hard, no longer willing to defend him. The decision had already been made, and Blake could feel it in the air. His time was up. The final blow came swiftly. The head of the board cleared his throat and, without hesitation, announced what Blake had feared the most. "Effective immediately, Richard Blake is no longer the CEO of this company. We will be launching a full investigation into these allegations and taking appropriate legal action." Blake's title, his authority, his very identity, it was all stripped away in an instant, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he rose from his chair, the once proud CEO looked like a shadow of the man he had been. His face was pale, his posture hunched, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of support. But there was none. His colleagues, his board members, even his closest confidants had turned their backs on him. His fall from grace was swift, public, and absolute. Blake had been at the top for so long, but in the end, his empire crumbled beneath the weight of his own greed and arrogance. The fallout from Blake's downfall was swift and far-reaching. As the news of his corruption and unethical behavior spread through the company, the board knew they had to act quickly to regain control of the situation. The reputation of the entire organization was now at stake, and the leadership recognized that a surface-level response wouldn't be enough. They needed to show both the employees and the public that serious changes were being made to ensure such abuses of power would never happen again. The first order of business was to implement structural changes at the highest levels of leadership. The board began by installing an interim CEO, someone with a reputation for transparency and ethical leadership. This individual was brought in not just to stabilize the company, but to oversee the extensive reforms that were about to take place. The board also announced a full external audit of the company's finances, ensuring that any lingering traces of corruption from Blake's era would be uncovered and addressed. In an effort to rebuild trust internally, the board introduced a series of new policies aimed at fostering a more inclusive and transparent workplace. One of the most significant changes was the establishment of a dedicated diversity and inclusion committee tasked with ensuring that employees from all backgrounds had equal opportunities for advancement. This committee was given real authority within the company, with a direct line to the board to report on issues of bias, discrimination, and fairness in promotions and hiring. Additionally, the board created stricter guidelines for financial oversight, including more stringent checks and balances on executive decision-making. No longer would one person, even the CEO, be able to operate unchecked. A whistleblower policy was also implemented, offering protection and anonymity to employees who came forward with concerns about unethical behavior. This policy encouraged transparency and accountability at all levels of the organization, empowering employees to speak up without fear of retaliation. Externally, the company issued a public statement acknowledging the scandal and the failure in leadership that had allowed it to fester for so long. They outlined the steps they were taking to rectify the situation, from the financial audits to the cultural changes within the organization. This transparency, though painful, was seen as a necessary step toward regaining the trust of both investors and the public. The company's brand had been tarnished, but the board was determined to turn this crisis into an opportunity for transformation. By addressing the underlying issues that had led to Blake's unchecked power and making structural changes that emphasized integrity and fairness, they hoped to rebuild their reputation and create a healthier, more just corporate environment for the future. Richard Blake's public fall from grace didn't just destroy his career, it shattered his personal life as well. Once at the pinnacle of corporate success, with wealth, influence, and a family that enjoyed the luxuries his position afforded, Blake now found himself in a free fall with no safety net. The first cracks appeared at home. His family, once basking in the comforts of his success, quickly distanced themselves as the media coverage of the scandal intensified. His wife, who had long tolerated Blake's obsession with power and wealth, saw a man she no longer recognized. The public shame was unbearable, and the whispers of his corruption extended beyond the boardroom to their social circles. Invitations to exclusive events disappeared, and longtime friends suddenly became unavailable. Blake, who had once been surrounded by admirers, found himself utterly alone. His children, who had enjoyed the privileges of their father's high-status life, now faced their own set of struggles. They, too, were dragged into the public eye, their father's disgrace making them targets of ridicule and gossip. Once admired for their family name, they now faced questions about how much they had benefited from Blake's ill-gotten wealth. The pressure weighed heavily on them, leading to strained relationships and even more distance between Blake and the family he had worked so hard to provide for. As the legal consequences of his actions loomed, Blake's finances took a devastating hit. Legal fees piled up as investigations into his corrupt dealings deepened. His assets were frozen as the company's board sought to recover the millions he had siphoned away, and his lavish lifestyle came crashing down. Properties were sold off, luxury cars repossessed, and private accounts drained. The man who once lived in opulence now faced the very real prospect of bankruptcy. In the solitude of his downfall, Blake was left to reflect on the choices that had led him here. The power he had wielded for so long, the fear he had instilled in others, and the empire he had built on manipulation and deceit had all crumbled beneath him. The people he had once controlled now moved on without him, and his name, once synonymous with success, was forever tarnished. As he sat in the empty shell of his once grand home, Blake finally understood the full weight of his actions. He had spent his life chasing power and wealth, but in the end, those very things had consumed him. The family, friends, and respect he had sacrificed to get to the top were gone, and all that remained was the bitter taste of karmic justice. For Richard Blake, there would be no redemption, only the long, slow fall from grace, with no one left to catch him. After the boardroom showdown and Blake's removal, David's life changed dramatically. No longer the overlooked employee, David became a symbol of integrity and courage within the company. His willingness to stand up for what was right, even at great personal risk, didn't go unnoticed. In the days following the scandal, the board reached out to David with an unexpected offer, a promotion to a senior leadership role. The company needed someone to help guide it through this tumultuous period, and there was no better candidate than David, the man who had exposed the corruption and stood for transparency. David accepted the role, but he knew that this wasn't just about a title or the perks that came with it. He saw this as an opportunity to effect real change within the organization, to dismantle the toxic culture that Blake had fostered, and replace it with one built on fairness, inclusion, and accountability. His first order of business was to meet with the leadership team and discuss immediate reforms, particularly around diversity and transparency. His promotion also earned him widespread recognition across the company. Employees who had previously felt voiceless saw David as a beacon of hope. His new position gave them confidence that things could finally change, and they weren't afraid to approach him with their concerns. David's office became a hub for conversations about improving the workplace, and he made it a point to stay accessible and open to everyone, regardless of their rank or background. But while the promotion was a validation of David's perseverance, it also came with its own set of challenges. He knew that transforming the culture would take time, and there were still remnants of the old guard who were resistant to change. However, with the trust he had earned and the power of his new position, David was prepared to take on these challenges head-on, determined to create a better future for both the company and the people who worked there. In the months following the scandal, the company underwent significant reforms aimed at addressing its long-standing issues with diversity, inclusion, and racism. David, now in a senior leadership position, was central to driving these changes. He understood that the toxic culture left behind by Blake couldn't be undone overnight, but with a clear vision and concrete steps, the company could rebuild itself on stronger, more inclusive foundations. One of David's first initiatives was the creation of a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion (DEI) committee, which was given real authority within the company. Unlike previous token efforts, this committee had a direct line to the board and was empowered to recommend structural changes in hiring, promotions, and corporate culture. The goal was to ensure that every employee, regardless of their race or background, had equal opportunities to succeed. This included transparent promotion criteria, bias training for managers, and a more equitable review process for all employees. David also pushed for the implementation of mentorship programs aimed at supporting minority employees. These programs paired seasoned leaders with junior employees from underrepresented groups to help them navigate the corporate environment and create a clearer path for career advancement. David knew firsthand the importance of mentorship and wanted to ensure that no one else would feel as isolated or sidelined as he once had. Additionally, hiring practices were overhauled. The company began partnering with organizations that specialized in recruiting diverse talent, making it a priority to bring in new voices and perspectives at every level. David worked closely with human resources to create recruitment strategies that actively sought out qualified candidates from different racial, ethnic, and gender backgrounds, ensuring that the company became a more representative and inclusive workplace. One of the most significant changes was the establishment of an anonymous reporting system that allowed employees to safely voice their concerns about discrimination, harassment, or any unethical behavior without fear of retaliation. David made it clear that every complaint would be thoroughly investigated and taken seriously, creating a culture of accountability that had been sorely lacking under Blake's leadership. These efforts weren't just surface-level changes. They were designed to embed diversity, inclusion, and fairness into the fabric of the company's operations. David's leadership was pivotal in making these reforms a reality, and he knew that his fight wasn't just about changing policies, it was about changing mindsets. Slowly but surely, the company began to transform into a place where employees felt valued and respected regardless of their background. It was the start of a new era, one where the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. The shift in the company's culture was palpable in the months following Blake's downfall and David's promotion. What had once been an environment stifled by fear and inequality transformed into one of openness, trust, and respect. The changes David helped implement, focused on diversity, inclusion, and transparency, had started to take root, and employees could feel the difference. Morale across the company saw a noticeable improvement. Employees who had once been afraid to voice their concerns about racism or discrimination were now empowered to speak up. The anonymous reporting system and the strengthened DEI committee gave them confidence that their voices would be heard and their issues addressed. With David at the helm, there was a renewed sense of safety and fairness, which allowed employees to feel more valued and secure in their roles. This shift in trust directly boosted engagement, creativity, and collaboration across teams. The overall workplace dynamic became more inclusive. People of different backgrounds, races, and experiences began to feel that they had a real shot at career advancement without the looming biases that had previously held them back. The mentorship programs David initiated played a huge role in fostering this dynamic, allowing employees from underrepresented groups to connect with senior leaders who could guide them. This mentorship also created stronger bonds within the company, as more senior employees became actively involved in the growth of their colleagues. Teamwork and collaboration flourished in this new environment. Without the cloud of Blake's oppressive leadership, employees were more willing to share ideas and work together. The toxic competitiveness that had once stifled innovation was replaced with a culture of mutual respect and shared success. Employees, now supported by clear and equitable leadership, were more motivated and committed to their work. The shared sense of purpose, fueled by David's victory and the reforms that followed, gave everyone a feeling of ownership in the company's success. In meetings, once dominated by a select few voices, more people felt confident to contribute. David's presence and leadership style fostered an atmosphere where all voices were welcome and decisions were made with transparency and collaboration. The company, now more diverse in its leadership and staffing, benefited from the breadth of perspectives that enriched its strategies and problem-solving approaches. Ultimately, David's triumph didn't just represent a change in leadership, it catalyzed a deeper cultural transformation. Employees began to see the company as a place where they could truly thrive, where hard work and integrity were valued over connections or power plays. It was no longer just a place of employment, it had become a community. David's victory signaled to everyone that standing up for what's right could spark real change, and it inspired employees to contribute to building a more just, inclusive, and empowering workplace. David's journey within the company had been long and filled with challenges, but it was also a testament to the power of resilience, integrity, and the pursuit of justice. He began as a promising, hard-working employee, eager to contribute and prove himself, yet repeatedly overlooked for promotions and opportunities due to systemic bias and racism. The microaggressions and barriers he faced were not just a reflection of a flawed corporate culture. They mirrored the larger societal struggles that many people of color experience in the workplace. Despite these setbacks, David never gave up. Instead, he quietly observed, endured, and, more importantly, prepared. He refused to allow the system to silence him, and when the opportunity finally came, he took a stand against Richard Blake, the company's corrupt CEO. What began as a refusal to shake Blake's hand during a company event evolved into a full-blown exposé of Blake's unethical behavior and financial misconduct. David's courage in that moment transformed him from an overlooked employee to a symbol of justice and equality within the company. His willingness to challenge the status quo sent a ripple effect throughout the organization, leading to significant reforms in the way the company addressed diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not only did David receive the recognition he had long deserved, but he also became a leader in transforming the toxic corporate culture he had fought against for so many years. In the end, David's journey was more than just a personal victory. It represented a shift in the company's values and priorities, one that emphasized fairness, accountability, and inclusion. By taking on a corrupt and powerful figure like Blake, David showed his colleagues and the world that it is possible to stand up for what's right, no matter how daunting the challenge may seem. His story serves as an inspiration for others to never back down from injustice, no matter how deep it runs. The moral of David's story is one that resonates far beyond the walls of any single corporation. It is a call to action for everyone who has ever faced discrimination, injustice, or inequality in their lives. Standing up against racism, prejudice, and corruption is not just a choice, it's a responsibility. David's refusal to accept the toxic environment created by Blake is a powerful reminder that change doesn't happen by staying silent. It happens when individuals take risks, speak truth to power, and challenge systems that perpetuate inequality. This story also highlights the importance of integrity. Throughout his journey, David remained true to his principles, even when it seemed like the easier path would be to stay quiet or simply move on. By staying committed to his values, David not only changed his own life, but also set off a chain reaction that improved the lives of others within the company. His leadership in the aftermath of the scandal became a model for how organizations can address deep-rooted issues of racism and bias, showing that change is possible, but only if we are willing to confront uncomfortable truths. For viewers, David's story is a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference. Whether in our workplaces, our communities, or in our personal lives, each of us can contribute to a culture of respect, inclusion, and fairness. Sometimes it only takes one person to start a movement. David's journey began with a simple act of defiance, refusing to shake Blake's hand, and it grew into something much bigger. It teaches us that even small acts of resistance can lead to profound change. This story challenges us to reflect on our own lives. How can we be more like David? How can we stand up to the injustices we witness, even when it feels like the odds are against us? The key takeaway is that while the road may be difficult, standing up for what is right is always worth it. Each of us has the capacity to create positive change, and when we do, we not only improve our own lives, but also the lives of those around us. David's victory was not just about toppling a corrupt CEO, it was about showing that, with courage and integrity, anyone can help build a better, more just world. So the next time you face a moment of injustice, remember David's story, and remember that you too have the power to stand up and make a difference. Thank you for joining us on David's powerful journey of standing up against injustice. His story reminds us of the impact one person can make in fighting for fairness and equality. If this story resonated with you, be sure to subscribe for more stories of resilience and change. What would you have done in David's position? Would you have taken the same stand? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss how workplaces can address racism and discrimination. Don't forget to share this video to inspire others. Change begins with all of us.